Hello, book lovers. Welcome back to this series of guided reading sessions of Agnes Grey, the novel by Anne Brontë. This is session 6, and today we're going to read and discuss together chapters 9 and 10. But you know the drill. Before we do that, let's refresh our memories and recap what we read last time in chapters 8 and 9. So, chapter 8 is a very short chapter and it's called The Coming Out. And the coming out means that was a very important occasion in a woman's life, um, especially middle upper class women. Coming out would be their introduction to society. And that meant that they could then attend social events such as balls and other activities. And more importantly, they were available for marriage. So, in other words, they were put in the market, in the marriage market, and shown off by their parents and their family as um, a good option for someone who's looking for a wife, especially a husband with a good fortune that could provide for her, right? So they have to show off in order to attract a good husband. And that's what these two chapters are about, right? So in the coming out, it's a very short chapter, and Miss Murray is going to come out into society. She's the oldest of the the children, the oldest of the girls. She's 18 years old, so she's going to come out at a fabulous ball, and she wants Agnes to postpone her trip back to her family so that she could see Rosalie's dress. Not because she wanted Agnes to attend the ball, because that would not be allowed as part of the working staff at their house. Agnes would not be allowed to participate in the ball, but she could see Rosalie's dress, and that's what she wanted Agnes to stay longer for instead of going back to her family. But of course, Agnes rejects this proposal and she goes back to her family. And chapter 9 is called The Ball, and then is after some time, so we don't read what happened um, during Agnes' stay with her family, only when she returns. And she and Rosalie have a conversation. Rosalie describes the ball, her vanity in being admired, making conquests, and making other women jealous. So you see how different they are from one another, right? How different they are as women and in how they present themselves to the world and what they hold as priorities. Because Rosalie, well, she tells Agnes that she detests all men that she met, but she wouldn't mind having to marry one of them if that made her the lady of a big house. So um, she is the personification of the mindset of the time. So she knew she had to marry, and she wanted to marry rich. Doesn't matter if she's not attracted to the person who would become her husband. But in reality, she would prefer to stay single for a long time and be adored by all. So the vanity, right, of being admired. And that is the complete opposite of Agnes, right? So that's where we left off last time. Let me get a sip of my coffee. Do you have your coffee or your cup of tea to accompany you in our readings today? And I would like to tell you that now we are in the month of October. There are very interesting things coming our way at Books and Culture. I will share the October schedule very soon, but there is a workshop in October and it is called The Doppelganger in Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We're going to read and discuss The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a classic of Victorian Gothic, and we're going to talk about the doppelganger, this motif, this figure in this presence in Gothic literature. And this is a surprise. I haven't shared this with anyone yet. But there will also be a lecture, a very special lecture in October, and it's special for you lovers of the Victorian period. It is called An Introduction to Victorian Literature, or perhaps it will come up with a more creative title, but it is an introduction to Victorian literature. So a combination of this lecture and the workshop will be a great way for you to expand your literary repertoire in the upcoming month of October, in our month of October. All right, so let's move on and read chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9, I mean, is it? No, we already read chapters 8 and 9. So today we're reading chapters 10 and 11. My mistake. Chapter 10 is called The Church. You see that each chapter has a very short title, right? All right, The Church. Well, Miss Grey, what do you think of the new curate? Asked Miss Murray on our return from church the Sunday after the recommencement of my duties. I can scarcely tell, was my reply. I have not even heard him preach. Well, but you saw him, didn't you? Yes, but I cannot pretend to judge of a man's character by a single cursory glance at his face. I just enjoy the interactions between Miss Murray, Rosalie, and Agnes. So, what they hold as priorities, right? So they are talking about the men, and um, uh, all Rosalie pays attention to is how he looks, if he's ugly or not, whereas Agnes has very different priorities. But isn't he ugly? He did not strike me as being particularly so. I don't dislike that cast of countenance. But the only thing I particularly noticed about him was his style of reading, which appeared to me good. Infinitely better, at least, than Mr. Hatfield's. He read the lessons as if he were bent on giving full effect to every passage. It seemed as if the most careless person could not have helped attending, nor the most ignorant have failed to understand. And the prayers he read as if he were not reading at all, but praying earnestly and sincerely from his own heart. Oh, yes, that's all he's good for. He can plod through the service well enough, but he has not a single idea beyond it. How do you know? Oh, I know perfectly well. I'm an excellent judge in such matters. Did you see how he went out of church, stumping along as if there was nobody there but himself, never looking to the right hand or the left, and evidently thinking of nothing but just getting out of the church and perhaps home to his dinner? His great stupid head could contain no other idea. I suppose you would have had him cast a glance into the squire's pew, said I, laughing at the vehemence of her hostility. Indeed, I should have been highly indignant if he had dared to do such a thing, replied she, haughtily tossing her head. Then, after a moment's reflection, she added, well, well, I suppose he's good enough for his place, but I'm glad I'm not dependent on him for amusement, that's all. Did you see how Mr. Hatfield hurried out to get a bow from me and be in time to put us into the carriage? So you see that Miss Murray is kind of complaining that the new curate has just left the church in a hurry without even looking at her or perceiving her. And Agnes knows, and she says, oh, perhaps you thought he should have taken a look at the squire's pew. That's where they sit. So the family's bench. And she said, oh, no, I should have been highly indignant if he did. But in fact, that is what she wanted all along, right? So she probably thinks it's outrageous that he should have left in such a hurry without even giving her, such a beautiful woman, a glance. On the other hand, Mr. Hatfield hurried out of his way to get a bow from me and be in time to put us into the carriage. Yes, answered I, internally adding, and I thought it somewhat derogatory to his dignity as a clergyman to come flying from the pulpit in such eager haste to shake hands with the squire, and hand his wife and daughters into their carriage. And moreover, I owe him a grudge for nearly shutting me out of it. For in fact, Though I was standing before his face, close beside the carriage steps, waiting to get in, he would persist in putting them up and closing the door till one of the family stopped him by calling out that the governess was not in yet. Then, without a word of apology, he departed, wishing them good morning and leaving the footman to finish the business. Nota bene, Mr. Hatfield never spoke to me, neither did Sir Hugh or Lady Meltham, nor Mr. Harry or Miss Meltham, nor Miss Green or his sisters, nor any other lady or gentleman who frequented that church, nor, in fact, any one that visited at Horton Lodge. That's painful, right? See, she's such a good woman, and she has so much to share, and she so much love to give. She's so much loved by her family, but she's there working for this family, and you see how the clergyman gets out of his way to flatter the family, the rich family, right, the squire's family, so to put them in the carriage to get a bow from them, and he shut Agnes out of the carriage and wouldn't even apologize when he heard that the governess was not yet in. So she was completely invisible to some people. And she says that no one talked, no one, not one of the ladies or gentlemen or visiting people at Horton Lodge ever spoke to her. So can you imagine that? It is an invisible existence, right? So servants would not even be considered people, right? They were there for the benefit of the big family, of the rich family, even though Agnes was should be in a higher level than the other servants. Miss Murray ordered the carriage again in the afternoon for herself and her sister. She said it was too cold for them to enjoy themselves in the garden, and besides, she believed Harry Meltham would be at church. So they would go to church more times during the Sunday, sometimes morning and afternoon, right? Um, For, said she, smiling slyly at her own fair image in the glass, he has been a most exemplary attendant at church these last few Sundays. You would think he was quite a good Christian. And you may go with us, Miss Grey. I want you to see him. He's so greatly improved since he returned from abroad. You can't think. And besides, then you will have an opportunity of seeing the beautiful Mr. Weston again and of hearing him preach. I did hear him preach, and was decidedly pleased with the evangelical truth of his doctrine, as well as the earnest simplicity of his manner and the clearness and force of his style. And there's a footnote here. In the paragraphs that follow, Agnes Grey's comparison of Weston, and that is the new curate, Mr. Weston, to the rector and former curate reflect Anne Brontë's religious preferences for evangelical rather than high church styles of preaching. For instance, Agnes mocks Hatfield's heavy use of ritual, pomp, and circumstance, and his emphasis on discipline, and instead praises Weston's simplicity and clarity. So there are two types of clergymen here. The high pomp of Mr. Hatfield with rituals and how he flatters the family, and what Agnes thinks is not is indignant for a clergyman, and Mr. Weston in his simple style, evangelical truth, and she really connects with his style of faith and preaching. It was truly refreshing to hear such a sermon, after being so long accustomed to the dry, prosy discourses of the former curate, and the still less edifying harangues of the rector, who would come sailing up the aisle, or rather sweeping along like a whirlwind, with his rich silk gown flying behind him, and rustling against the pew doors, mount the pulpit like a conqueror ascending his triumphal car, then sinking on the velvet cushion in an attitude of studied grace, remain in silent prostration for a certain time, then mutter over a collect, and gabble through the Lord's Prayer, rise, draw off one bright lavender glove to give the congregation the benefit of his sparkling rings, lightly pass his fingers through his well-curled hair, flourish a cambric handkerchief, recite a very short passage, or perhaps a mere phrase of scripture as a headpiece to his discourse, and finally deliver a composition which, as a composition, might be considered good, though far too studied and too artificial to be pleasing to me. The propositions were well laid down, the arguments logically conducted, and yet it was sometimes hard to listen quietly throughout without some slight demonstrations of disapproval or impatience. See how she criticizes his way of acting, of exaggerated performance, right? And of the way he dresses, wearing jewelry, silk clothes. This is not how, in her view, a clergyman should behave. A clergyman should be simple, humble, should preach God's faith and the words in the Bible, but without all the rich pomposity, the artificial, showy sentences, right? They should be easily understandable by the people at church, not be overly complicated just to show off the curate's intellect, right? Um, His favorite subjects were church discipline, rites and ceremonies, apostolical succession, the duty of reverence and obedience to the clergy, the atrocious criminality of dissent. Dissent, meaning those who would not follow any other religion that would not conform to the High Church of England. So that was considered um, a crime. And for a long time in England, those dissenters would be persecuted and they could not hold offices in government, or they were, it was called social, kind of a social death. There was another word for it. I'll see if I can remember, right? But they were denied a lot of rights just because of their faith. So if they did not conform to the High Church of England, they would be considered dissenters. And here, this Mr. Hatfield would love to to preach about the atrocious criminality of dissent, the absolute necessity of observing all the forms of godliness, and reprehensible presumption of individuals who attempted to think for themselves in matters connected with religion, or to be guided by their own interpretations of Scripture, and occasionally to please his wealthy parishioners. The necessity of differential obedience from the poor to the rich, supporting his maxims and exhortations throughout with quotations from the fathers, with whom he appeared to be far better acquainted than with the apostles and evangelists, and whose importance he seemed to consider at least equal to theirs. So see the role of the church in that community, right, when led by this man. So he would preach certain truth that had to be accepted by all, including that the criminality of dissent, that people should not interpret the Bible or the scriptures on their own. They should accept the interpretation of the clergyman, meaning that they had no agency in that process. They had just to absorb what was told them and reproduce that way of thinking. And look, he would even preach the necessity of differential obedience from the poor to the rich. So it was really a brainwashing ritual, right? So the people attending there, everyone would attend church, of course, at different places. Each social, depending on your social class and your rank, you would be sitting at specific places in the church, getting in and out in specific entrances and exits. But they would be taught to be obedient to. I mean, the servants will be taught to be obedient to their masters, their employers, to the rich, being thankful for the rich. You see the danger there? But now and then he gave us a sermon of a different order, what some would call a very good one, but sunless and severe, representing the deity as a terrible taskmaster, rather than a benevolent father. Yet, as I listened, I felt inclined to think the man was sincere in all he said. He must have changed his views and become decidedly religious, gloomy and austere, but still devout. But such illusions were usually dissipated on coming out of church by hearing his voice in jocund colloquy with some of the Melthams or Greens, or perhaps the Murrays themselves, probably laughing at his own sermon and hoping that he had given the rascally people something to think about. Perchance exulting in the thoughts that old Betty Holmes would now lay aside the sinful indulgence of her pipe, which had been her daily solace for upwards of 30 years, that George Higgins would be frightened out of his Sabbath evening walks, and Thomas Jackson would be sorely troubled in his conscience and shaken in his sure and certain hope of a joyful resurrection at the last day. Thus, I could not but conclude that Mr. Hatfield was one of those who bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them upon men's shoulders, while they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers, and that make the word of God of none effect by their traditions, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. I was well pleased to observe that the new curate resembled him, as far as I could see, in none of these particulars. So that's quite an interesting passage, right? How she describes the old curate Hatfield and how he preached and how he performed a role on the pulpit and as he lives. So every now and then there is a very austere, gloomy sermon about representing God as a terrible taskmaster. So encouraging people to do what they're told, otherwise you would infuriate God. And then, but when leaving outside, he would just be laughing. I hope I scared some of the people here to, make them stop smoking or make them stop taking evening walks, and mocking the whole thing, not taking it seriously, right? So taking advantage of his position. And Agnes is happy that the new curate is nothing like the old one. Well, Miss Grey, what do you think of him now? Said Miss Murray, as we took our places in the carriage after service. No harm still, replied I. No harm, repeated she in amazement. What do you mean? I mean, I think no worse of him than I did before. No worse? I should think not, indeed. Quite the contrary. Is he not greatly improved? Oh, yes, very much indeed, replied I, for I had now discovered that it was Harry Meltham she meant, not Mr. Weston. So Rosalie couldn't care less, right, about Agnes's own musings. She's thinking about how a prospective suitor, Harry Meltham, was, how he was there. That gentleman had eagerly come forward to speak to the young ladies, a thing he would hardly have ventured to do had their mother been present. He had likewise politely handed them into the carriage. He had not attempted to shut me out like Mr. Hatfield. Neither, of course, had he offered me his assistance. I should not have accepted it if he had. But as long as the door remained open, he had stood smirking and chatting with them, and then lifted his hat and departed to his own abode. But I had scarcely noticed him all the time. My companions, however, had been more observant, and as we rolled along, they discussed between them not only his looks, words, and actions, but every feature of his face and every article of his apparel. You shan't have him all to yourself, Rosalie, said Miss Matilda at the close of this discussion. I like him. I know he'd make a nice, jolly companion for me. Well, you're quite welcome to him, Matilda, replied her sister in a tone of affected indifference. And I'm sure, continued the other, he admires me quite as much as he does you. Doesn't he, Miss Grey? I don't know. I'm not acquainted with his sentiments. Well, but he does, though. My dear Matilda, nobody will ever admire you till you get rid of your rough, awkward manners. Oh, stuff. Harry Moutham likes such manners, and so do Papa's friends. Well, you may captivate old men and younger sons, but nobody else, I'm sure, will ever take a fancy to you. I don't care. I'm not always grubbing after money like you and Mamma. If my husband is able to keep a few good horses and dogs, I shall be quite satisfied, and all the rest may go to the devil. Well, if you use such shocking expressions, I'm sure no real gentleman will ever venture to come near you. Really, Miss Grey, you should not let her do so. I can't possibly prevent it, Miss Murray. And you're quite mistaken, Matilda, in supposing that Harry Meltham admires you. I assure you he does nothing of the kind. Matilda was beginning an angry reply, but happily our journey was now at an end, and the contention was cut short by the footman's opening of the carriage door and letting down the steps for our descent. So let's continue with chapter 11 called The Cottagers. But before we do that, I would like to take a look at one of the notes here about Weston, the new curate, right? The new clergyman whom Agnes admires. So the footnote says most critics and biographers agree that Bronte based the character of Weston in part on William Wakeman, a young curate who worked for Patrick Bronte, Anne's father, from 1839 to 1842. Many also suggest that Anne Bronte was in love with Wakeman. So that's an interesting connection, right? There are a lot of biographical echoes in Agnes Grey. We've discussed that already. So this could be one of them as well. So, of course, when we write, we always base it on our personal experience. So it is hard, and you should not really. It's hard to separate um, uh, personal life, with fiction. On the other hand, it's you should not try to find truths about Anne Bronte's life in her fiction, right? But it could possibly be that the character of Mr. Weston was inspired by, not that it is a true um, personification, right? But inspired by this curate that worked um, for her father, and that she could possibly have had feelings for. So that's an interesting piece of information. All right, so let's continue with chapter 11, The Cottagers. As I had now only one regular pupil, though she contrived to give me as much trouble as 3 or 4 ordinary ones, and though her sister still took lessons in German and drawing, I had considerably more time at my own disposal than I had ever been blessed with before, since I had taken upon me the governess's yoke, which time I devoted partly to correspondence with my friends, partly to reading, study, and the practice of music, singing, etc., partly to wandering in the grounds or adjacent fields with my pupils if they wanted me, alone if they did not. So finally, she has some time for herself. It's very nice to see how she occupies herself, not in an idle manner, right? Either for physical exercise, walking, and mental improvement, studying, reading, etc. Often, when they had no more agreeable occupation at hand, the Misses Murray would amuse themselves with visiting the poor cottagers on their father's estate to receive their flattering homage, or to hear the old stories or gossiping news of the garrulous old women, or perhaps to enjoy the pure pleasure of making the poor people happy with their cheering presence, and their occasional gifts so easily bestowed, so thankfully received. This is this was quite common practice. So um, their father, Mr. Murray, is the squire, so he owns the land, and the poor cottagers are the people who would live on the land and pay rent, right? There's um, there's a footnote here. Typically, the poorest individuals in rural areas, cottagers lived on land and in cottages owned by the local landlord, who could possibly be Mr. Murray. So they would pay rent, and also um, part of the money they would make from the land to the landlord. That's how landed people made money. So they didn't have to work. They owned land. So that's how they made money. Um, but look how Agnes phrases it. The young Mrs. Murray would go there to amuse themselves, because they thought that merely their presence there would be something to make the poor people happy, and the gifts that they brought, and. Um, so let's read more about this contact between the young ladies and the cottagers. Sometimes I was called upon to accompany one or both of the sisters in these visits, and sometimes I was desired to go alone to fulfill some promise which they had been more ready to make than to perform, to carry some small donation or read to one who was sick or seriously disposed, and thus I made a few acquaintances among the cottagers, and occasionally I went to see them on my own account. I generally had more satisfaction in going alone than with either of the young ladies, for they, chiefly owing to their defective education, comported them towards their inferiors in a manner that was highly disagreeable for me to witness. They never in thought exchanged places with them, and consequently had no consideration for their feelings, regarding them as an order of beings entirely different from themselves. They would watch the poor creatures at their meals, making uncivil remarks about their food and their manner of eating. They would laugh at their simple notions and provincial expressions, till some of them scarcely durst venture to speak. They would call the grave elderly men and women old fools and silly old blockheads to their faces, and all this without meaning to offend. So they thought of themselves, and they were not the only ones, right? This would be a common mindset for the upper classes, that they were a complete separate sort of people than the poor cottagers or working people. Um, and they would do all these offenses, right? Saying things to their faces, criticizing the way they spoke, the way they dressed, they ate, they behaved, thinking that was completely normal, right? But Agnes found it very hard to witness. I could see that the people were often hurt and annoyed by such conduct, though their fear of the grand ladies prevented them from testifying any resentment. But they never perceived it. They thought that, as these cottagers were poor and untaught, they must be stupid and brutish. And as long as they, their superiors, condescended to talk to them and to give them shillings and half crowns or articles of clothing, they had a right to amuse themselves, even at their expense, and the people must adore them as angels of light, condescending to minister to their necessities and enlighten their humble dwellings. I made many and various attempts to deliver my pupils from these delusive notions without alarming their pride, which was easily offended and not soon appeased, but with little apparent result. And I know not which was the more reprehensible of the two. Matilda was more rude and boisterous, but from Rosalie's womanly age and ladylike exterior better things were expected. Yet she was as provokingly careless and inconsiderate as a giddy child of 12. One bright day in the last week of February, I was walking in the park, enjoying the threefold luxury of solitude, a book, and pleasant weather. I do like this threefold luxury indeed as well, Agnes. Solitude, a book, and pleasant weather. For Miss Matilda had set out on her daily ride, and Miss Murray was gone in the carriage with her mamma to pay some morning calls. But it struck me that I ought to leave the selfish pleasures and the park with its glorious canopy of bright blue sky, the west wind sounding through its yet leafless branches, the snow wreaths still lingering in its hollows, but melting fast beneath the sun, and the graceful deer browsing on its moist herbage already assuming the freshness and verdure of spring, and go to the cottage of one Nancy Brown, a widow, whose son was at work all day in the fields, and who was afflicted with an inflammation in the eyes, which had for some time incapacitated her from reading, to her own great grief, for she was a woman of a serious, thoughtful turn of mind. I accordingly went and found her alone, as usual, in her little close, dark cottage, redolent of smoke and confined air, but as tidy and clean as she could make it. She was seated beside her little fire, consisting of a few red cinders and a bit of stick, busily knitting with a small sackcloth cushion at her feet, placed for the accommodation of her gentle friend, the cat, who was seated thereon, with her long tail half encircling her velvet paws, and her half-closed eyes dreamily gazing on the low, crooked fender. Well, Nancy, how are you today? Why, middling, miss, and myself, my eyes is no better, but I'm a deal easier in my mind nor I have been, replied she, rising to welcome me with a contented smile, which I was glad to see, for Nancy had been somewhat afflicted with religious melancholy. I congratulated her upon the change. She agreed that it was a great blessing, and expressed herself right down thankful for it, adding, if it please God to spare my sight, and make me so as I can read my Bible again, I think I shall be as happy as a queen. I hope he will, Nancy, replied I. And meantime, I'll come and read to you now and then, when I have a little time to spare. With expressions of grateful pleasure, the poor woman moved to get me a chair, but as I saved her the trouble, she busied herself with stirring the fire and adding a few more sticks to the decaying embers, and then, taking her well-used Bible from the shelf, dusted it carefully and gave it to me. On my asking if there was any particular part she would like me to read, she answered, well, Miss Grey, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to hear the chapter in the first epistle of St. John that says, God is love, and he that dwells in love dwells in God, and God in him. With a little searching, I found these words in the fourth chapter. When I came to the seventh verse, she interrupted me, and with needless apologies for such a liberty, desired me to read it very slowly, that she might take it all in, and dwell on every word, hoping I would excuse her as she was but a simple body. The wisest person, I replied, might think over each of these verses for an hour, and be all the better for it, and I would rather reread them slowly than not. In a way, she's doing here, so she is comforting the old lady with religious texts, and also with company, with comfort, with her presence there, right? So she is doing what the courage should be doing, right? Mr. Hatfield would never do that, right? Enter a cottager's home and, bring God's words to them. But that's what Agnes does. Accordingly, I finished the chapter as slowly as need be, and at the same time as impressively as I could. My auditor listened most attentively all the while, and sincerely thanked me when I had done. I sat still about half a minute to give her time to reflect upon it, when, somewhat to my surprise, she broke the pause by asking me how I liked Mr. Weston. I don't know, I replied, a little startled by the suddenness of the question. I think he preaches very well. Aye, he does so, and talks well too. Does he? He does. Maybe you haven't seen him, not to talk too much yet? No, I never see anyone talk to, except the young ladies of the hall. They're nice, kind young ladies, but they can't talk as he does. Then he comes to see you, Nancy. He does, miss, and I'm thankful for it. He comes to see all us poor bodies a deal ofter nor Master Bligh or the rector ever did, and it's well he does, for he's always welcome, and we can't say as much for the rector. There is what says they're fair feared of him. When he comes into a house, they say he's sure to find something wrong and begin a calling them as soon as he crosses the door stunts. But maybe he thinks it's his duty like to tell them what's wrong, and very often he comes on purpose to reprove folk of for not coming to church, or not kneeling and standing when other folks does, or going to the Methody chapel or something of that sort. But I can't say that he ever found much fault with me. He came to see me once or twice before Master Weston come, when I was so ill troubled in my mind, and as I had only very poor health besides, I made bold to send for him, and he came right enough. I was sure distressed, Miss Grey. Thank God it's over now. But when I took my Bible, I could get no comfort of it at all. The very chapter that you've just been reading troubled me as much as always. He that loveth not knoweth not God. It seemed fearsome to me, for I felt that I loved neither God nor men as I should do, and could not if I tried ever so. And the chapter 4, where it says, He that is born of God cannot commit sin. And another place where it says, Love is the fulfilling of the law. And many, many others, miss. I should fair weary you out if I was to tell them all, but all seemed to condemn me and to show me what I was not in the right way. And as I knew not how to get into it, I sent our Bill to beg Master Hatfield to be as kind as look in on me some day, and when he came, I told him all my troubles. So you see, now Agnes is very surprised to know that Mr. Weston comes to this old lady, to Nancy, to talk to her. And the old lady, so Nancy compares Mr. Weston, who comes to comfort her, with Mr. Hatfield, that used to come every now and then and only to reprove the people, to condemn them, to tell them what was wrong, and to make them afraid of God. So she's talking about this time that she called Mr. Hatfield to tell him his troubles. And what did he say, Nancy? Why, miss, seemed to scorn me. I might be mistaken, but he gave a sort of a whistle, and I saw a bit of a smile on his face, and he said, Oh, it's all stuff. You've been among the Methodists, my good woman. But I told him I'd never been near the Methodists, and then he said, Well, says he, you must come to church where you'll hear the scriptures properly explained instead of sitting poring over your Bible at home. So, Mr. Hatfield from the High Church, he does not believe in self-interpretation of the Bible. People should listen to the correct explanation given by him on the pulpit. And he condemns the Methodist chapel. And here there's a footnote. The Methodist High Church Anglicans like Hatfield disparaged Methodism, a nonconformist Protestant sect inspired by the teachings of John Wesley. Favoring open-air Bible reading and hymn singing, Methodism drew its faithful primarily from the lower and lower middle classes. But Mr. Hatfield condemned that right away. So stop reading the Bible on your own. What you're doing, you're following Methodist way of thinking. You should come to my church and hear how I explain the Bible. But I told him I always used coming to church when I had my health. But this very cold winter weather, I hardly durst venture so far, and me so bad in the rheumatism and all. But he says it'll do your rheumatism good to hobble to church. There's nothing like exercise for the rheumatism. You can walk about the house well enough. Why can't you walk to church? The fact is, says he, you're getting too fond of your ease. It's always easy to find excuses for shirking one's duty. But then, Miss Grey, it wasn't so. However, I told him I tried. But please, sir, says I, if I do go to church, what the better shall I be? I want to have my sins blotted out, and to feel that they are remembered no more against me, and that the love of God is shed abroad in my heart. And if I can get no good by reading my Bible and saying my prayers at home, what good shall I get by going to church? The church, says he, is the place appointed by God for his worship. It's your duty to go there as often as you can. If you want comfort, you must seek it in the path of duty. And a deal more, he said, but I cannot remember all his fine words. However, it all came to this, that I was to come to church as often as ever I could, and bring my prayer book with me, and read up all the sponsors after the clerk, and stand and kneel and sit and do all as I should, and take the Lord's Supper at every opportunity, and hearken his sermons at Master Blythe's, and it would be all right. If I went on doing my duty, I should get a blessing at last. But if you get no comfort that way, says he, it's all up. Then, sir, says I, should you think I'm a reprobate? And reprobate here means According to Calvinist doctrine, a person who is predestined to eternal damnation. So, according to Calvinism, each one was born with one specific predestination, and there's nothing you can do about it in life. That's how you're going to end up. And some were the chosen ones who were uh, predestined to go to heaven, and those who were predestined for damnation. She was then afraid, am I a reprobate then? Why? Says he. He says, if you do your best to get to heaven and can't manage it, you must be one of those that seek to enter it at the straight gate and shall not be able. Oh, then he asked me if I'd seen any of the ladies of the hall about that morning, so I told him where I'd seen the young misses go on the moss lane, and he kicked my poor cat right across the floor and went off after them as gay as a lark. But I was very sad. The last word of his fair sunk into my heart and lay there like a lump of lead till I was weary to bear it. However, I followed his advice. I thought he meant it all for the best, though he had a queer way with him. But you know, miss, he's rich and young and such like cannot right understand the thoughts of a poor old woman such as me. But, however, I did my best to do all as he bade me. But maybe I'm plaguing you, miss, with my chatter. Oh, Nancy, go on and tell me all. Well, my rheumatism got better. I know not whether with going to church or not, but one frosty Sunday I got this cold in my eyes. The inflammation didn't come on all at once, like, but bit by bit. But I wasn't going to tell you about my eyes. I was talking about my troubles of mind. And to tell you the truth, Miss Grey, I don't think it was anyways eased by coming to church, not to speak on at least. I like got my health better, but that didn't mend my soul. I hearkened and hearkened the ministers, and read my prayer book, but it was all like sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. The sermons I couldn't understand, and the prayer book only served to show me how wicked I was, that I could read such good words and never be no better for it, and often feel it a sore labor and a heavy task beside, instead of a blessing and a privilege, as all good Christians does. It seemed like as all was barren and dark to me. And then them dreadful words, many shall seek to enter it and shall not be able. They like as they fair dried up my spirit. But one Sunday, when Mr. Hatfield gave out about the sacrament, I noticed where he said, if there be any of you that cannot quiet his own conscience, but requireth further comfort or counsel, let him come to me, or some other discreet and learned minister of God's word, and open his grief. So, next Sunday morning afore service, I just looked into the vestry and began talking to the rector again. I hardly could fashion to take such liberty, but I thought when my soul was at stake I shouldn't stick at a trifle. But he said he hadn't time to attend to me then. And indeed, says he, I have nothing to say to you but what I've said before. Take the sacrament, of course, and go on doing your duty, and if that won't serve you, nothing will. So don't bother me any more. So then I went away. But I heard Master Weston. Master Weston was there, miss. This was his first Sunday at Horton, you know, and he was in the vestry in his surplice, helping the rector on with his gown. Yes, Nancy. And I heard him ask Master Hatfield who I was, and he said, oh, she's a canting old fool. And I was very ill grieved, Miss Grey, but I went to my seat, and I tried to do my duty as aforetime, but I like got no peace. And I even took the sacrament, but I felt as though I were eating and drinking to my own damnation all the time. So I went home sorely troubled. But next day, afore I'd gotten fettled up, for indeed, miss, I'd no heart to sweeping and fettling and washing pots, so I sat me down in the muck. But who should come in but Master Weston? I started sitting stuff then, and sweeping and doing, and I expected he'd begin a calling me for my idle ways, as Mr. Hatfield would have done. But I was mistaken. He only bid me good morning, like in a quiet, decent way. So I dusted him a chair and fettled up the fireplace a bit. But I hadn't forgotten the rector's words, so I said, I wonder, sir, you should give yourself that trouble to come so far to see a canting old fool such as me. He seemed taken aback at that, so he would fain persuade me that the rector was only in jest, and when that wouldn't do, he says, "Well, Nancy, you shouldn't think so much about it. Mr. Hatfield was a little out of humor just then. You know we're none of us perfect. Even Moses spoke unadvisedly with his lips. But now sit down a minute, if you can spare the time, and tell me all your doubts and fears, and I'll try to remove them." So I sat me down next to him. He was quite a stranger, you know, Miss Grey, and even younger than Master Hatfield, I believe, and I had thought him not so pleasant looking as him, and rather a bit crossish at first to look at, but he spoke so civil like, and when the cat, poor thing, jumped on his knee, he only stroked her and gave a bit of a smile. So I thought that was a good sign, for once, when she did so to the other rector, he knocked her off, like as it might be in scorn and anger, poor thing. But you can't expect a cat to know manners like a Christian, you know, Miss Grey. No, of course not, Nancy. But what did Mr. Weston say then? He said nothing, but he listened to me as steady and patient as could be, and never a bit of scorn about him. So I went on and told him all, just as I've told you, and more too. Well, says he, Mr. Hatfield was quite right in telling you to persevere in doing your duty, but in advising you to go to church and attend to the service and so on, he didn't mean that was the whole of a Christian's duty. He only thought you might there learn what more was to be done, and be led to take delight in those exercises instead of finding them a task and a burden. And if you had asked him to explain those words that trouble you so much, I think he would have told you that if many shall seek to enter in at the strait gate, and shall not be able, it is their own sins that hinder them. Just as a man with a large sack on his back might wish to pass through a narrow doorway, and find it impossible to do so unless he would leave his sack behind him. But you, Nancy, I dare say, have no sins that you would not gladly throw aside if you knew how. Indeed, sir, you speak truth, says I. Well, says he, you know the first and great commandment, and the second which is like unto it, on which two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. You say you cannot love God, but it strikes me that if you rightly considered who and what he is, you cannot help it. He is your father, your best friend. Every blessing, everything good, pleasant, or useful comes from him. And everything evil, everything you have reason to hate, to shun, or to fear comes from Satan, his enemy as well as ours. And for this cause was God manifest in the flesh, that he might destroy the works of the devil. In one word, God is love. And the more of love we have within us, the nearer we are to him, and the more of his spirit we possess. Well, sir, I said, if I can always think on these things, I think I might well love God. But how can I love my neighbors when they vex me and be so contrary and sinful as some of them is? It may seem a hard matter, says he, to love our neighbors, who have so much of what is evil about them, and whose faults so often awaken the evil that lingers within ourselves. But remember that he made them, and he loves them, and whosoever loved him that begat love, and whosoever loved him that begat, loveth him that is begotten also. If God so loveth us that he gave his only begotten Son to die for us, we ought also to love one another. But if you cannot feel positive affection for those who do not care for you, you can at least try to do them as you would they should do unto you. You can endeavor to pity their failings and excuse their offenses, and to do all the good you can to those about you. And if you accustom yourself to this, Nancy, the very effort itself will make you love them in some degree. To say nothing of the goodwill your kindness would beget in them, though they might have little else that is good about them. If we love God and wish to serve him, let us try to be like him, to do his work, to labor for his glory, which is the good of men, to hasten the coming of his kingdom, which is the peace and happiness of all the world. However powerless we may seem to be in doing all the good we can through life, the humblest of us may do much towards it. And let us dwell in love, that he may dwell in us, and we in him. The more happiness we bestow, the more we shall receive, even here, and the greater will be our reward in heaven when we rest from our labor. I believe, miss, them is his very words, for I've thought them over many a time. And then he took that Bible and read bits here and there and explained them as clear as the day, and it seemed like as a new light broke in my old soul, and I felt fair a glow about my heart, and only wished poor Bill and all the world could have been there and heard it all and rejoiced with me. After he was gone, Hannah Rogers, one of the neighbors, came in and wanted me to help her to wash. I told her I couldn't just then, for I hadn't set on the potatoes for dinner, nor washed up the breakfast stuff yet. So then she began calling me for my nasty, idle ways. I was a little bit vexed at first, but I never said nothing wrong to her. I only told her, like all in a quiet way, that I'd had the new parson to see me, but I'd get done as quick as ever I could, and then come and help her. So then she softened down, and my heart, like as it warmed towards her, and in a bit we was very good friends. And so it is, Miss Grey, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. It isn't only in them you speak to, but in yourself. Very true, Nancy, if we could always remember it. Ay, if we could. And did Mr. Weston ever come to see you again? Yes, many a time, and since my eyes has been so bad, he's sat and read to me by the half hour together. But you know, miss, he has other folks to see and other things to do, God bless him. And that next Sunday he preached such a sermon. His text was, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And them two blessed verses that follows. You wasn't there, miss. You was with your friends then, but it made me so happy. And I am happy now, thank God. And I take a pleasure now in doing little bits of jobs for my neighbors, such as a poor old body's hats have blind can do. And they take it kindly of me, just as he said. You see, miss, I'm knitting a pair of stockings now. They're for Thomas Jackson. He's a queerish old body, and we've had many a bout at thripping one after another, and at times we've differed sorely, so I thought I couldn't do better nor knit him a pair of warm stockings. And I felt to like him a deal better, poor old man, since I began. It's turned out just as Mr. Weston said. Well, I'm very glad to see you so happy, Nancy, and so wise. But I must go now. I shall be wanted at the hall, said I. And bidding her goodbye, I departed, promising to come again when I had time, and feeling nearly as happy as herself. At another time, I went to read to a poor laborer who was in the last stage of a consumption. The young ladies had been to see him, and somehow a promise of reading to him had been extracted from them. But it was too much trouble, so they begged me to do it instead, of course. I went willingly enough, and there too I was gratified with the praises of Mr. Weston, both from the sick man and his wife. The former told me that he derived great comfort and benefit from the visits of the new parson, who frequently came to see him and was another guest sort of man to Mr. Hatfield, who before the other's arrival at Horton had now and then paid him a visit, on which occasions he would always insist upon having the cottage door kept open to admit the fresh air for his own convenience, without considering how it might injure the sufferer, and having opened his prayer book and hastily read over a part of the service for the sick, would hurry away again if he did not stay to administer some harsh rebuke to the afflicted wife, or to make some thoughtless, not to say heartless, observation rather calculated to increase than diminish the troubles of the suffering pair. Whereas, said the man, Mr. Weston will pray with me quite in a different fashion, and talk to me as a kind, and often read to me too, and sit beside me just like a brother. Just for all the world, exclaimed his wife. And about a 3 weeks since, when he seed how poor Jem shivered with cold, and what pitiful fires we kept, he asked if we're stock out of coals was nearly done, if our stock of coals was nearly done. I told him it was, and we was ill set to get more, but ma'am, I didn't think of helping us. But however, he sent us a sack of coals next day, and we've had good fires ever since, and a great blessing it is this winter time. But that's his way, Miss Grey. When he comes into a poor body's house, seeing sick folk, he notices what they most stand in need of, and he thinks they can't readily get in themselves. He never says nothing about it, just gets it for them. And it isn't everybody that would do that, that has as little as he has. For ma'am, he's now not at all to live on. He has nothing at all to live on but what he gets from the rector, and that's little enough, they say. I remembered then, with a species of exultation, that he had frequently been styled a vulgar brute by the amiable Miss Grey, because he sported a silver watch and clothes not quite so bright as fresh as Mr. Hatfield's. In returning to the lodge, I felt very happy and thanked God that I had now something to think about, something to dwell on as a relief from the weary monotony, the lonely drudgery of my present life. For I was lonely. Never from month to month, from year to year, except during my brief intervals of rest at home, did I see one creature to whom I could open my heart or freely speak my thoughts with any hope of sympathy or even comprehension. Never one, unless it were poor Nancy Brown, with whom I could enjoy a single moment of real social intercourse, or whose conversation was calculated to render me better, wiser, or happier than before, or who, as far as I could see, could be greatly benefited by mine. My only companions had been unamiable children and ignorant, wrong-headed girls, from whose fatiguing folly unbroken solitude was often a relief most earnestly desired and dearly prized. But to be restricted to such associates with a serious evil, both in its immediate effects and the consequences that were likely to ensue. Never a new idea or a stirring thought came to me from without, and such as rose within me were, for the most part, miserably crushed at once, or doomed to sicken and fade away because they could see no light. Habitual associates are known to exercise a great influence over each other's minds and manners. Those whose actions are forever before our eyes, whose words are ever in our ears, will naturally lead us, albeit against our will, slowly, gradually, imperceptibly perhaps, to act and speak as they do. I will not presume to say how far this irresistible power of assimilation extends, but if one civilized man were doomed to pass a dozen years amid a race of intractable savages, unless he had power to improve them, I greatly question whether, at the close of that period, he would not have become at least a barbarian himself. And, as I could not make my young companions better, feared exceedingly that they would make me worse, would gradually bring my feelings, habits, capacities to the level of their own, without, however, imparting to me their light-heartedness and cheerful vivacity. Already I seemed to feel my intellect deteriorating, my heart petrifying, my soul contracting, and I trembled lest my very moral perception should become deadened, my distinctions of right and wrong confounded, and all my better faculties be sunk at last beneath the baleful influence of such a mode of life. The gross vapors of earth were gathering around me, and closing in upon my inward heaven, and thus it was that Mr. Weston rose at length upon me, appearing like the morning star in my horizon, to save me from the fear of utter darkness. And I rejoiced that I had now a subject for contemplation that was above me, not beneath. I was glad to see that all the world was not made up of Bloomfields, Murrays, Hatfields, Ashbys, etc., and that human excellence was not a mere dream of the imagination. When we hear a little good and no harm of a person, it is easy and pleasant to imagine more. In short, it is needless to analyze all my thoughts, but Sunday was now become a day of peculiar delight to me. I was now almost broken into the back corner in the carriage, for I liked to hear him, and I liked to see him too, though I knew he was not handsome, or even what is called agreeable in outward aspect, but certainly he was not ugly. In stature he was a very little above the middle size, perfectly symmetrical in figure, deep-chested and strongly built. The outline of his face would be pronounced too square for beauty, but to me it announced decision of character. His dark brown hair was not carefully curled like Mr. Hatfield's, but simply brushed aside over a broad, white forehead. The eyebrows, I suppose, were too projecting, but from under those dark brows There gleamed an eye of singular power, brown in color, not large, and somewhat deep-set, but strikingly brilliant and full of expression. There was character, too, in the mouth, something that bespoke a man of firm purpose and an habitual thinker, and when he smiled, but I will not speak of that yet, for at that time I mentioned I had never seen him smile. I had never seen him smile, and indeed his general appearance did not impress me with the idea of a man given to such a relaxation, nor of such an individual as the cottagers described him. I had early formed my opinion of him, and in spite of Miss Murray's objurgations, was fully convinced that he was a man of strong sense, firm faith, and ardent piety, but thoughtful and stern. And when I found that to his other good qualities was added that of true benevolence and gentle, considerate kindness, the discovery perhaps delighted me the more, as I had not been prepared to expect it. And that is the end of chapter 11, The Cottagers. What an interesting chapter, right? I really enjoyed it, to know how uh, the different relationship with the cottagers that the ladies have as a sort of amusement, a kind of a zoo, to go there to make fun of the people and to present themselves as superior, as a gift to the poor, that they're there, and they give out promises that they don't want to keep, so they make Agnes keep the promises they had made. But Agnes finds true solace in talking to some of the cottagers. She finds true, finally, a true social intercourse, she writes, right? True, a social connection. She can be herself, be open, but she knows that these people have an intellect below hers. So she doesn't get much out of that conversation. She misses um, talking to people that would make her better, improve her mind, her intellect. And she is afraid that by only having contact with people like the poor cottagers and the vain, morally wrong people like the Miss Murrays, she would um, uh, she would become inferior. She would deteriorate. That's the word she uses. And then comes Mr. Weston, a morning star, a bright light, a source of fire, of hope in her life, and she wants to get to know him better. Although he doesn't look nice, he's not ugly, but he doesn't look nice. Only when he smiles. But at that point in the narrative, he hasn't smiled to her yet. So you see how the older narrator is looking back. So we know something's coming out of this, right? There's this beautiful introduction to the character of Mr. Weston, and we know their relationship will grow because the older narrator gives us a hint that they have shared a more intimate relationship because he has smiled to her, right? So looking forward to see what sort of relationship will develop. Um, I hope you've enjoyed reading these two chapters. I personally liked them very much. Um, Next time in session 7, we're going to read chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 is called The Shower, and chapter 13 is called The Primroses. So if you've enjoyed this session, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and I hope to see you again in our next session. Bye-bye.